and artists such as Ruggeri, Somaini, Pomodoro, Fontana, Cosentino, Munari. To Ponti, building a temple is like building the essence of religion into ourselves. It meant going beyond the style issue of a period and trying to reproduce a building as an expression of faith in the emphasized form of each period. Surely those churches, that relationship between clients, artists, architects, society, and industry show a happy union of faith, art, and architecture. Montini's extraordinary period of interactions in Milan was called, as reported in the French magazine Art Sacré, Miracle in Milan. Now, can the churches of that period be a model? Is it a model that we need to find? A reliable model? These are the questions posed by Maria Antonietta Crippa, an eminent scholar and an expert of sacred art, on her paper entitled The Architecture of God. Montini's approach could be borrowed to enhance the mediation role of artists and designers, start again a process of widespread education for contemporaries by means of exhibits, debates, and communication initiatives, set up a permanent and cross-sectional network of researchers supported by universities and oriented publishing to promote their communication and experiences and carry out investigation of scenarios and views. Systemizing reality and research in a combination that could facilitate the management of the enormous wealth of contents and relations instead of dealing with them separately. I'm thinking about what was done by the Bose community, by the Diocesan Museums of Bergamo and Venice, by the research department of the Cornet Biennale exhibit, not to mention some lower, so to speak, initiatives that come from a few online and paper publishers. One of the goals of the culture of design, at least in its academic form, is to promote research, to set up existing but fragmentary network, not much in order to review its features, but mainly to understand how applicable it can be. The work is not only to build something new, but also to restore the sacrality of what already exists, to infuse life to the contemporary sacred. Schools and magazines should regain their very important role. And here I should mention again our tradition, our Italian tradition, without any retro affections. The accomplishments of the School Beato Angelico to the Occult Foundation in Milan, which was unfortunately closed down and completely left to itself, were remarkable. Thanks to the interaction of all the school's laboratories, sculptures, painting, architecture, furniture, and clothes, it was possible to provide comprehensive solution for the rearrangements of sign and figurative messages, while the ritual spaces was managed by focusing on the layout of the assembly and liturgical poles, altar, amber, baptistry, cathedral, and tabernacle. The school's activity was particularly important in the field of applied arts, both before and after the council. Sacred ornaments and sacred furnishings left an imprinting in the Italian production, influenced other operators as well, for example, Baroviero and Toso, Fontana Arte, and Caloi. Refined clients' tastes, and also affected the manufacturing revolution of sacred vestments and episcopal and presbyterial insignia. As regards the equipment used for the cult's rituals, from the very beginning the school favored an organic and coherent unity of the liturgical opus, in that it refused the concept of the church as a museum where to disorganically keep valuable works, and affirmed that every work within the complex liturgical scape should mainly, if not exclusively, have a cultural and mystagogical function. In design schools and university, that is a dormant issue. They adapt to borrow approaches and signs from contemporary designers found a fertile ground in those architects who, when commissioned a sacred architecture project, also deal with ornaments and internal elements, thus continuing the tradition of greatly renowned cases of the Bologna and Milano dioceses from the 50s to the 70s. Their work is carried out with the rule of uniqueness, involving artists when requested, and contacted experienced wood processing and furniture companies for seats, confessional, sacristies, and choirs. An example is Caloi and Genuflex, a well-known company that already collected important collaborations with Ponti and Michelucci and Spadolini, and recently designed for new models together with Sartogo, Isola, Meyer, Di Biasio, and Ghiandelli. Genuflex, as you can see, is following in the same footsteps, with furniture signed by Portoghesi Piano and Botta. There's other many examples, but maybe I don't have a lot of time. As far as this relationship between design and the sacred is concerned, I would like to cite theologian Don Giuliano Zanchi, the director of the Bergamo Diocesan Museum, who emphasized the refusal from the side of some companies operating in this field of taking the challenge of change, and also highlighted the difficulties of design to fill the formal gap between the objectuality of interior design and that of liturgical symbols. Another vacancy is requested by the absence of specialized publishing. This should be an agenda-setting issue for all media, in particular for the publisher linked to the culture of design and art. That's the starting point, research and communication. It is only from this point that we can convince the enterprise world, the one gathering in the fairs of Vicenza and Bologna, for example, with the Koine and Tanexpo shows. These are amongst the most important polls in terms of contents, numbers of exhibition and audience, both in Italy and in Europe. I'm finishing. I'll finish by citing Diderot as he described the trouble of collecting and connecting facts. In particular, I'd like to recall the so-called Diderot effect, defined by the American anthropologist Grant McCracken. McCracken coined the term Diderot effect after a novella written by the French writer, in which the main character felt compelled to redecorate his room because everything looked discordant to the new dressing gown he had just received as a gift. Objects, says Diderot, should belong to a material and non-material system of goods to support its symbolic function and the represented values. This principle finds a successful application in modern churches, and this is something that should be retrieved in the effort to stylistically coordinate works of art and architecture, position liturgical poles in such a manner that the assembly space becomes the new liturgical fire, to conceive design solutions as the result of a dialogue between inside and outside places, to make a church a storytelling system and product that is able to tell individual stories in the universal dimension, to express a worldview resulting from our own relationship with objects and people. In his editorials, Church and Area, Glauco Gresleri, an architect and untiring advocate of the Cardinal Reccaro's revolution in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Bologna, insisted on the concept of design as a spiritual act which gains a community function in two ways. From one side, through the development of universal values, and from the other side, through the common fruition of a solution at the moment of its use. Thus, the design of a church implies statutory values of the design act itself, above all the value of communication. The sacred building draws people and makes space available for them. Only afterwards, the other elements filled with a semantic task for the specific space become apparent. Functionality, convenience, and adherence to standards come together with the need of design to combine and transmit a meaning, a representation, and a symbol. Also in the interior design, the detection of hierarchy of formal and aesthetical choices prove the ability to spread communication values where architecture looks for a systematic semantics, while liturgy stands as a set of symbols looking for formal, figurative expressions. This is not the place to list the features that should distinguish liturgical ornaments from those of a mere service or from an artifact suspended between devotional tradition and ritual signs. With regard to this, just to provide an example, AIDI, Italian Association of Lighting Application, and CEI, Italian Episcopal Conference, wrote an handbook for the design of lights in a place of Catholic worship. This text, soon to be published, is the result of several years of research. The church is a place of physical and liturgical hospitality. In a scene of welcome, meeting, and expression of its very nature as a church, this is the only meaning. I'm on my way to finish. This is the only meaning it is meant to have. And the culture of design is the answer to the technical need of creating of the necessary conditions. Design should be regarded as a language and interpretation, as a vehicle of attitudes and institutions, as a mean and rule, as a representation code, and never should it succumb to the ideological deception of a simple metaphor. The church is again feeling the urge of exploring a new language both in art and architecture, and it's been doing a lot already. When the Pope made his auspicious mention of beauty last November from the Sistina Chapel, he cited Braque's statement, "Art upsets, science reassurance." It is now the task of those who deal with beauty as a profession to confirm that the aesthetical dimension of the sacred is a promise as well as a contemporary announcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Actually, especially right at the end, you got me wanting to ask 27 questions, so we'll have to keep moving. Great stuff. Okay, Steve, I think you're next. Let me get this down. Is there any way to raise the house lights just a little bit? Yeah. Let's see here. And get that. Okay. Great. All right. Thank you. Love looking at your work here in your CV. Steve, I think recently completed your Master of Architecture and Certificate in Sustainability at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Also, very interesting, diverse background, though, has a bachelor's in philosophy in 2004, and was in the seminary, as I understand, as well from 2000 to 2004 in the Archdiocese of Denver. So he brings to us both architecture and seminary training, so I can't wait to see what you're going to show us. Come on up. Thank you.
After hearing the opening remarks yesterday by Michael, my talk kind of fits more into the expanding the tradition kind of area of sacred architecture. So I'm going to set myself a timer so I don't go over. My students that I teach right now, they love to tell me when I'm going over time, so you guys can just wave if I'm going over time. I'm used to it. The thought of rising before the sun never much appealed to me. The rector at the seminary, however, never saw fit to ask my thoughts on the house schedule. Sorry, that was too far. So it was that I spent 4 years of my life willing myself out of bed for pre-dawn morning prayer. The more ambitious, older brothers of the community set the example, getting up more than an hour early so they could rightly and prayerfully reflect on the office of readings prior to the morning's communal rites. Other less disciplined, younger brothers, such as myself, emerged from our rooms just minutes before the invitatory intonation. The dormitory of the seminary took the form of a long, thin wing that connected perpendicularly to the chapel at the tower, which in turn acted as a joint. As each of us groggily surfaced from our rooms, hair still shining from frantic wet downs under sink faucets, and cassocks half unbuttoned, we began our quotidian pilgrimage. The hallway, our own Camino de Compostela, serving as our spiritual journey, and the chapel, our shrine, where in one voice our common entreaty rang out, "O God, come to my assistance. Lord, make haste to help me." The quotidian pilgrimage is the consequence of life's relentless search for meaning and purpose, life's search for the sacred. In the seminary, or a similar monastic environment, This takes the form of obedience, an act of surrender to a will larger than yours, in the hope of synchronizing the patterns and rhythms of your life with those of the transcendent. This milieu quite naturally lends itself to the realization of life as a daily pilgrimage, as almost every action, every space, and even the mere act of moving through the day is ritualized. The comparison to the secular world is not quite as fluid or direct, but this does nothing to diminish the pursuit. While the lived experience is quite different, the motivation of both the layperson and the monastic is much the same: a yearning for a place that holds within itself inexhaustible funds of otherness. Essentially, we are seekers, seeking to belong, seeking to love and be loved, seeking our place in this beleaguered existence. In this seeking, our hunger and thirst for that which transcends the quotidian bursts forth, dependably finding fault with our daily tedium. It is this seeking that has led people, and still leads people, to leave their homes and journey to far-off places with the hope that they will find that which eludes them. It is the seeking for a place within the ubiquitous placelessness of the world. Historical pilgrimages sought to pay homage, worship or seek forgiveness, healing or favor from God. The modern pilgrimage, however, exhibits not only a yearning for the transcendent, but also a dissatisfaction with the complete spaces in which we often find ourselves, propelling us toward perpetual departure. Michel de Certeau speaks of modern life as a perpetual pilgrimage, in which we all, with the certainty of what is lacking, knows of every place and object that is, quote, not that. One cannot stay there or be content with that. This signals a crisis of place in which even the environments we create for ourselves fail to become particular, individual, or meaningful. If it is our houses, offices, gyms, grocery stores, and churches that define our spaces, then it is these same spaces that fail to define our place. The dearth of place in modern life. The dearth of place in modern life is the source of our restlessness, for it is the source of the relentless urge to displace ourselves and the inescapable personal impression of displacement. Even in the daily journey so common to the modern man, the commute, are found traces of the pilgrimage. In looking at the definition of the word commute, we find a transformational element. As a transitive verb, it connotes a change, an altering, or a conversion, as can be seen from its Latin root mutare, and from which we also derive words such as mutate, and mutable, and mutual. Yet the very idea of commuting is one that carries with itself an inherent dissatisfaction with place, and perhaps even an inverted notion of pilgrimage. As a modern phenomenon, commuting implies a desire to be somewhere other than we toil to make our life's work. The suburb is a daily escape from one place to another. In a very real sense, the home becomes an attempt at an approximation of the shrine of the daily pilgrimage. It is a poor substitute, for in attempting to escape from the homogeneity and tedium of the everyday and the non-places of our menial lives, we've run to tract homes strewn along arbitrary lines on a map. We find ourselves to be pilgrims, sojourning daily from non-places toward non-places, and back toward that which continuously leaves us wanting and yearning for not this. This absence of an axis mundi, of grounding, empties the quotidian pilgrimage of its ontic efficacy. What lacks is a place of permanence, places of repose. In primitive times, these have been found through the sublime views of mountaintops, the womb-like enclosures offered by the cave and the grotto, the natural expanse and shelter of the forest, or the sheer monumentality of monolithic geologic objects. In the absence of such natural phenomena, we recreated them. The artificial mountains at Giza and the man-made caverns held within them, the womb-like crypts of early Christian constructions, the towering tree-inspired columns of Gothic cathedrals, and the countless steeples and minarets that served to orient the quotidian pilgrim. In the past, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the archetypal agrarian town was grounded by the stereotypical town square, which in turn was anchored by the local parish, the axis mundi. All other activity revolved both physically and symbolically around the sacred space. In going about the daily activities of life beneath the steeple, each person within the community was at least visually and or aurally reminded of the transcendent through the church's towering presence and the bell's regular gongs. The church acted as the axis mundi that tethered each individual to the sacramental interior life of the church, essentially acting as a spatial sacramental. It was a shrine for the daily pilgrimage of the faithful. Yet today, examples of such axes of transcendence within our daily lives are sadly rare. Even in those spaces purpose-built for worship, mediocrity and the mundane tend to be the rule rather than the exception. And even if these spaces do succeed in breaking the typical homogeneity of space to allow for the eruption of the sacred, they are generally removed from the daily experience of the average person. The modern pilgrim's yearning for place, for the sacred, remains unsatisfied. So the question remains, how does one superimpose or insert the sacred in the midst of an abject poverty of place? What is called for is a generous sacred architecture, an architecture that is at once the expression and the source of the transcendent, an architecture that arises as human creation but persists as transforming, life-altering environments, an architecture that first manifests and then transforms human aspirations and intentions, an architecture that makes visible the sacred within the paths of the everyday pilgrim. Pragmatically, this means that I believe it to be critical to break the current dogmatic, traditionalist trend in American Catholic Church architecture. In an attempt to recreate the sacred places of past epochs, we instead create caricatures, structures that stand not as monuments and authentic expressions of our faith, but rather monuments that point to our own spiritual poverty and creative impotence. Further, it is critical, especially in this time of needed self-reflection, that we as church reconsider how we relate to the world around us, institutionally but also formally, shifting away from traditional forms that emphasize hierarchy and separation toward those that engender transparency, humility, generosity, receptivity, and communion. It is only an architecture born of our own time and culture, of our own struggles and sins, that can truly be an authentic expression of our faith. I'm not advocating a severing of the ties to our Western architectural patrimony, but if we are to create transcendent places, we must learn from it rather than copy it. Let me return just for a moment to the archetypal agrarian town of the past. In this idealized place, what we now call quote-unquote traditional architecture served well, for it was an architecture born of that time, that culture, and that scale. But in seeking to reinsert the sacred into the paths of the contemporary quotidian pilgrim, we must begin to examine the patterns, needs, and structures of our own time and culture. Our streets, traversed by automobile, not foot, are lined by commerce, food, and fortunes, ever the proximate and the transient, rarely the transcendent. Even if there were a church, such as that from our agrarian town, its steeples and bells, which once might have served as a tether to the sacred, cease to be relevant, for they are now merely seen and heard, not encountered or heeded, or they are obscured altogether. What I propose is not so much a practical solution, but rather conjecture as to what it might mean to reinsert the sacred back into the paths of the daily pilgrim. Inspired by the ubiquity of the roadside shrines in Bavaria and the street shrines in Hong Kong, this intervention takes the form of 7 shrines, placed in the most unexpected or profane places. Those places that are the daily haunts of modern life, those places where we live. Each shrine draws inspiration from one of the 7 sacraments to explore the spatial, phenomenal, and ritual qualities of sacred space. In so doing, I'm not advocating the replacement or the negation of the parish church, but rather the creation of spatial sacramentals, tethering the modern pilgrim to the sacramental life of the larger church. These shrines presented here are my personal expressions of my own quotidian pilgrimage, as well as persistent elemental spaces that transcend the individual to encapsulate the aspirations and dissatisfaction of the larger human condition. By embracing and existing within the profane boundaries of our daily lives, they give a means by which we can transform even the most menial of daily tasks and acts of transcendence and holiness. In setting out to discover my own quotidian pilgrimage, I gave myself an assignment to discover the well-trod paths of my life. The assignment was threefold. First, to become more aware of all aspects of my life. Second, to journal throughout each day, noting, sketching, and writing about experiences as they happened. And third, at the end of the day, I was to compile all the day's disparate wanderings into a basic diagram. After a week, I synthesized all the daily diagrams into a larger map, in which the paths, rhythms, and spaces of my life become visually discernible. And from this map, I chose the seven sites for the 7 shrines. At this point, if I was going to read the rest of it, it would probably about 30 minutes. So I'm just going to kind of paraphrase the shrines and the ideas behind them. And each of these, they're not meant to be replacements, and I'm not trying to cause scandal as like these aren't meant to be replacements for the sacraments. There's spatial sacramentals about ideas of tethering you to the sacred life, the inner life of the church. And so what I did is I took the 7 places that I most frequented in my own life, and this was about 6 to 7 months ago. I've since moved, but and I kind of thought about shrines that would really tether people and myself personally to kind of sacred space, into the kind of the transcendence that is given by sacred space. So the first shrine, which is in a park where I used to walk my dog, is in a place called Finley Springs in Gainesville, Florida, and it was a place which was really an expression of baptism. This picture was taken in the middle of December. And as you can see, even in Florida, we do have winters that kill things. But here we have an abundant amount of green because there's a natural spring that runs underneath this area. The local kids have appropriated the space as well for their fort. And it was very much a space about cleansing, about rebirth, and and obviously baptism comes to mind. And so I created a kind of a shrine that dealt both with there's a lot of kind of theological thinking about how the shrine is done. In the diagram, especially in the tripartite nature of it, water, light, spatial convergence, spatial compression, as well as openness, to kind of recreate the notion of submerging into the water. Also the water, the light well in the water comes in the middle of the trees, and also kind of elevated, the notion of being elevated through the gift of baptism. So spatial sacramental. So a place to go on your daily kind of grind. The second one, every weekend I would travel down to Orlando to visit with my partner, and this was the space. I would travel 2 hours on my weekly pilgrimage to be, and it became a pilgrimage within a pilgrimage. And so I thought, well, what better place to have a shrine than on a highway, a place of total mesmerization, a place of complete, lack of space, because the space you're actually in is your car, not the highway. And I was struck by the notion of confession, reconciliation, and the idea of the examination of conscience and the examination of consciousness. And so it was an idea of having a shrine of disruption, to disrupt the monotony of the road by creating kind of a disruption, by creating this massive hill, which would never be built. It's very conjectural, obviously, and theoretical, but the idea of, and kind of paralleling it with the acts of going into the confessional, the act of confession, the act of counsel, act of contrition, absolution, and penance, a very scripted kind of rite, spatial and kind of landscape rite. The third was Eucharist at Walmart. We all got to go to the grocery store. Well, there's no place that's more non-communal than Walmart, I think. I mean, we've all had the experience of, fighting in lines at the grocery store or Walmart, in the parking lot, just a very kind of hectic place. And the place that, markets used to be places of community. And so I thought, what better place to have a place of union, a communion, than this place. And so I kind of create a new axis mundi in the middle of a Walmart, with kind of a spatial shrine that creates kind of a steeple within the Walmart that calls people toward itself, and a place of communion, a place to commune, to sit down, to be quiet, to have real places of quiet and transcendence. Excuse me. And within the ritual that I kind of programmed the space with, it includes many of the kind of liturgical qualities of the Eucharistic rite as well. Obviously not kind of a copying or an approximation of nothing sacrilegious like that, but kind of a communal meal. The fourth is my home. It was a place of, it was for confirmation, the place where I go to and it was the only shrine that I kind of designed that would travel with me. A place, it was a chair, and among people that I talked about this with, this was the most controversial of all the shrines that I made, and it was, people hated it or loved it, and so. But for me, it was about the notion of being in a place, being in one place that where you affirm your existence through your thought, your reflection, and your readings, this is the one shrine that actually moves with me. The fourth is in studio, architectural studio, the place I think that most of us know, some love, some hate, but we spent much of our time in our formative years, and if we're still teaching, we probably still spend a lot of time there. This to me was a kind of analogous to the notion of marriage, stone sharpening stone, critique becoming union. They're kind of two narratives that I kind of thought spatially for the shrine, but they're both kind of involved. So I'm not going to get into them here, but you can read them in my paper if you're interested. And then the sixth shrine is the shrine for ordination. And I was really struck by people stretching on mats, and I was struck by the act of prostration and the liturgy of ordination as this notion, the gym is a place of people wanting to be different, aspiring to something else, aspiring toward health, aspiring toward an image. And the act of prostration, when they sing the Litany of Saints at the liturgy of ordination, it's all about aspiring to be holy. And so there's a kind of a real kind of interesting kind of corollary to me there. And so there's a whole kind of, again, ritual that I involved in this shrine as well. And finally, the last shrine for anointing is in the same place as the first one. It's in the same park, but a different part of the park. And I liked the circularity of the sacraments because we don't experience the sacraments as one-time deals, and the circularity of our lives as well. And so this one is in the middle of the woods, the trees reaching to the sky, and yet the shrine firmly planted in the ground. So this kind of tethering between the earth and the sky, heaven and earth, I think is an interesting kind of spatial but also spiritual tethering. In conclusion, I'll just kind of read my conclusion real quick. How am I on time? Okay, great. The quotidian pilgrimage, above all else, is a call for the expression of what and where we consider sacred, or the call for the expansion of what and where we consider sacred. It is a call for authenticity in sacred placemaking, and a rejection of a false aesthetic orthodoxy within Catholic architecture. It is a call for the liberation of sacred space, releasing it from the confining traditional bounds of churches, so that it might exist in a radical receptivity toward the quotidian pilgrim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I just want to make two quick comments on that before we go on to the very next one. I'm very happy your paper's in here. I'd ask you to go seek out Duncan Stroik and have a dialogue with him, and Duncan to have a dialogue with you, because if we can't do that at this conference, where can we do it? And I am very, very happy that you brought your ideas here. Number one. Thank you, and I've even got it already. I can see how frustrating this is, because after every talk I want to have a 30-minute discussion about everything that happened. Okay, the next paper will be presented by Andrea Mihalake. It's also in conjunction with her working on the paper was Professor Paul Emmons. I know Andrea from her teaching here. I've had the privilege of teaching with her on one studio here at CUA. It was wonderful. She graduated from, now how am I supposed to pronounce that? Iominku University of Architecture and Planning in Bucharest, Romania, and came to the U.S. as a Fulbright scholar at CUA, where she also taught for 5 years. She's currently teaching and pursuing her PhD degree at the Washington Alexandria Architecture Center of Virginia Tech. And Professor Paul Emmons received his PhD from University of Pennsylvania under Marco Frascati and Joseph Rickwert. He is currently an associate professor and the director of the PhD program at the Washington Alexandria Architecture Center. Thank you very much. Come on up.
Thank you, Michael. So the title of the paper that I'm going to present today is On Dirt, Foundation Rites and the Material Imagination of Early Medieval Sacred Architecture, which is quite a jump from from Vatican Council, but we'll get there as well. So on material imagination, first of all. The Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, the document of the Second Vatican Council that has provided the guidelines for Catholic architecture in the last decades of the 20th century, emphasizes the, quote, full and active participation by all the people in the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, end quote. In the further developments of Catholic churches, this recommendation has been understood primarily as a spatial relation between the celebrant and the congregation that led to centralized plan configurations which tend to accommodate better this relation. While this communication model is no doubt important, its interpretation seems to have overlooked the role of materials in defining interpersonal relationships. By looking back to early medieval architecture, this paper proposes to revisit the role of materials and material imagination in creating contemporary sacred architecture and reinforcing the sense of community. The study will investigate the evocative role of materials in medieval foundation legends, with a particular focus on the function of dirt. Dirt as the agency through which a fundamental aspect of religious architecture is activated, the continuity of sacred as location and as community. As an alternative to the common understanding of imagination as the, quote, the faculty that forms images, end quote, French philosopher Gaston Bachelard proposes that imagination actually deforms, changes, and transforms what is present in order to think and envision an absence. He defines two sorts of imagination, a formal one, which is an image that we've already seen probably several times during the symposium, that deals primarily with shape and appearance, and a material one that stems directly from the matter, and I'll go back to the second example a little bit later, toward the end. While the former is concerned with the extravagant novelty that produces intense, though fleeting, visual excitement, the latter tends to delve into the depths of being in search of more profound and timeless meanings. More often than not, formal imagination is privileged as an immediate strategy in contemporary religious architecture, and materials are applied to rather than generate the physical form. While investigating the hermeneutics of church design from liturgical, theological, and historical perspectives, remarkable recent theoretical works, such as Richard Kiekhaefer's Theology in Stone from 2004, or Kevin C. Solz's A Sense of Sacred from 2005, allow little space for the creative potential of material imagination. Kiekhaefer, for instance, analyzes light and materials as factors that determine a certain aesthetic impact, but this still occurs through the agency of form. The holy, he argues, is rarely experienced directly. It, too, is mediated by sacred forms. End quote. The acknowledgement of the relevance of materials remains similarly in a formal field. Quote, the materials used are obviously of crucial importance. Subtle texture of most stone provides more warmth than concrete and generally wears more gracefully. Brick and wood can both contribute to an atmosphere of graceful simplicity. Juxtaposition of colors is just as strong a factor, end quote. The function of materials seems to address direct sensory perception, but with no implication for their further imaginative potential or symbolic meanings. This paper will explore the evocative powers of materials in foundation legends of early medieval religious architecture through the investigation of matter rather than formal typologies. Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln Cathedral in the first half of the 13th century, and one of the most learned men of his day, wrote treatises that covered topics from theology and philosophy to optics, mathematics, cosmology, and astronomy. Following the theological conception of the creation of the universe, accepted at that time, in his treatise on light, Grosseteste proposes that light, the first element of God's creation, spreads out to its thinnest and then becomes denser as it focuses toward the center. Thus it produces water and earth, the latter being the most compact of all bodies, where all the higher lights are gathered together. Grosseteste recalls the name Pan, or whole, given to the earth by the poets, and also the idea that earth is the mother of all things, that, although solid, still participates to the divine grace. Thinking of earth, or dirt, as concentrated light with fecund properties has an imaginative potential that can inform the design of sacred architecture. In his 13th century treatise, Rationale Divinorum Officiorum, the French bishop William Durand of Mende synthesizes the symbolism of church building. His accounts are constructed through analogy. The physical church on earth is the representation of the Holy Church in heaven. The architectural body of the church is a collective body of the church members, and essential for our discussion, materials are themselves living and breathing bodies. According to their location, in the foundation or in the walls, texture, polished or square, or size, big or small, The stones represent qualities of the faithful that are literally building the body of the physical and metaphysical church. The way in which materials come together is analogous to alchemical processes. Thus, the lime, which stands for charity, combines itself with the sand, an earthly matter that stands for the body of the community. Bound together with water, a representation of the Holy Spirit, lime and sand form the cement that holds in place the stones of the edifice. The symbolism of earth in Duan's treatise suggests that stone, as an equivalent of earth, is a medium that simultaneously engenders and receives the new edification, holds together the building and the community, and ensures their continuity in time and space. As scholars of religion have observed, space in religious and social terms is not homogeneous, and certain sites are charged with a value that renders them significant and different. In foundation legends, the location of a religious edifice and its footprint are directly communicated through dreams, visions, and revelations in which place and community are bound through the agency of materials. As we shall see further, humans do not select the site of the sacred building, but this is instead revealed to them. The materials used to identify the site are oftentimes liquids fixed into solid state. And this process of material becoming is analogous to Grosseteste's ideas on the solidification of light. From its very beginning, edification is thus born through material imagination. Filarete's architecture treatise from the 15th century describes an elaborate ritual for the foundation of a new city that is based on the similitude between the human body, the architecture, and the cosmos. Just as a human being, the city has a beginning, a life, and an end, symbolized by the words life and death inscribed on a ritual vase and the portraits of Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, the three fates that unfold the thread of life. Among the different symbolic objects that would be placed in the foundation, such as this bronze book containing information on the founders of the city, the architect prepared 3 separate glasses filled with water, wine, milk, oil, and honey. Like the pure water, the inhabitants of the city should be clear and clean and useful to others. Wine is a valuable liquid if used in moderation. The white milk provides nourishment and also the symbolic purification of the citizens. The olive tree that produces the oil is dedicated to Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom that should bring victory and peace over the city. The bees that produce the honey are industrious, severe, and just, and like them, the inhabitants of the city should love and obey their ruler like their father. The fate of the architecture is thus intertwined with that of the community, and it is the materials placed in the foundation that enable the active relationship of these living presences. The symbolism recalls earlier construction rituals from ancient Mesopotamia, where the making of the bricks required the direct intervention of the king. Evidence of kings carrying baskets with mud bricks, construction tools, and even partaking in the construction process have been recorded on several plaques, both in writing and images. And if I had a laser pointer, I could point to the king carrying the baskets. King Assurbanipal reported that, quote, "I made bricks for the temple of Gula in Babylon out of cuttings of aromatic plants in a mold made of ebony and wood. I had them wield the hoe, and I saw the correct laying of the foundations," end quote. Another current practice in the edification of temples was the mixing of the mortar with cedar oil, fine oil, honey, perfumed oil, cedar resin, fine beer, or wine. While the royalty is at the same time an agent of the divine intervention and the abiding substance that keeps the community together, these flavorsome and aromatic materials nourish and keep alive the body of the building. On material and immaterial architectural beginnings. The founding legend of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, recorded later in the 13th century, was attributed to a miraculous snowfall during the night of August 4th in the year 325. The Virgin Mary visited Pope Liberius, asking him to build the church in the place where the snow would fall. The next morning, the Pope drew the ground floor of the edifice with a hoe in the snow. And this is a 15th century representation by Masolino that shows Mary with Christ reaching down out of heaven to explain how to cast the plan of the building. So the next morning the Pope drew the ground floor of the edifice with a hoe in the snow. The tool itself, used for gardening and cultivating the ground, suggests not just the removal of the snow, but also the action of slicing the earth to plant the new building. Thus, the snow as fertilizing, solidified water, and the tool as the agent of impregnating the earth, suggest the growth of the building from dirt as a living body. A similar legend is associated with the founding of the Hildesheim Cathedral, attributed in the 12th, 13th centuries to the miracle of frost, which is said to have formed outlines representing a church. In the 7th century, the Count Malgarius saw in a dream an angel that asked him to found a church dedicated to St. Peter. The angel indicated the site of the future building and pointed out the measurements of the basilica with a reed, which he drew like a plough after him. The following morning, Malgarius, with his family, did find the place indicated by the angel and saw dew everywhere on the grass except in the place where he had seen the angel walk. He will build a basilica and later enter the monastery himself. An 11th century psalter from the Abbey of Soignies depicts the dream of Malgarius, who is lying horizontally on a bed. Above him, an angel hovers from the heavens, represented by a semicircular arc. In his left hand, he holds a long staff that ends with a cross and is presumably tracing the outline of the church. The dreamlike world suggested in this miniature is located between heaven and earth, and the relation between the two protagonists is negotiated through the materiality of the rod and that of the dew. A similar account relates the foundation of Mont Saint-Michel Monastery in France by Saint Aubert, who sees dew all over the summit of the mountain, except in the area where the foundations of the sanctuary are to be laid. These stories are about architecture beginnings and foundation of communities, which could not exist without each other. The spiritual life of the community could not flourish outside the material life of the architecture. The snow, the frost, and the dew from these foundation legends share similar characteristics. They all represent different states of water. The substance that fertilizes the earth allows the growth of plants and nourishes life. They are also a diaphanous, in-between state of matter that will soon vanish through melting or evaporation. This fragility negotiates the relation between the visible and the invisible. The church is thus a living body that grows from the ground and has the immaterial condition of a place between heaven and earth. A legend from the 16th century recalls the 9th century foundation of the Fraumünster Church in Zurich. In 853, King Ludwig II founded a convent whose location was revealed to his daughters by a stag with flaming antlers sent by God, who led the two girls to the chosen site. The Swiss chronicle that documented this story in the 16th century also recounts that the boundary of the building site was outlined with a rope sent from heaven. A 16th century representation of the founding legend shows the two angels holding the rope above the building site. Ropes as buildings and drawing instruments are recorded in the medieval legend of the foundation of the monastery of Cluny III. One night, Gonzo, a paralyzed monk who is sleeping in the infirmary of Cluny II, sees St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. Stephen appear in his dream. St. Peter expresses their discontent with the current state of Cluny II and urges Gonzo to communicate to Abbot Hugh their request to have a new monastery built. Using ropes, the saints lay out for Gonzo the plan and measurements for the new church that he is supposed to transmit to the abbot. The miniatures represent the saints indicating the dimensions of the church, and Gonzo explaining them to the monks. Placed in a particular historical context, the dream has different meanings. From a practical point of view, it provides a divine justification for the expenses required by the construction of Cluny III. In the early 11th century, Benedictine monasticism was accused of straying away from the principles of asceticism and restraint promoted by the founder of the order. Therefore, in this context, the divine intervention demanding the building of a new church was a guarantee of the validity of the project. On the other hand, the characters present in the foundation dream have a particular significance related to architectural beginnings. Saint Stephen was lapidated to death, and his representations usually include stones and a martyr's palm, while in Eastern Orthodoxy, he is often depicted holding the model of a church or a censer. His connection with architectural stuff is thus embedded in his own martyrdom, which transforms the stone from weapon into building material. Saint Paul was one of the apostles who went on multiple missionary journeys and established new churches, so his presence stands for the idea of founding new Christian communities. Saint Peter, whose own name means rock in Latin, was designated by Christ to be the stone on which I will build my church. The significance of Gonzo's dream is thus strongly related with architectural beginnings, not only through the direct message that is communicated to the monk, but also through the particular characters of the messengers. Like in other foundation legends, the nature of the material suggested snow, dew, frost, stones, ropes, activate the imagination and leave open the inaugural process of constructing the architecture. Unlike formal imagination that employs a linear narrative, material imagination unfolds on multiple levels through analogies and associations. It collapses past and present and constructs several layers of meaning. I would like to conclude with a contemporary example that illustrates the richness of thinking through materials. In 2007, Brother Klaus Chapel, designed by Peter Zumthor, was completed near Cologne in Germany. Nicolaus of Fluhe lived in the 15th century, and at the age of 50, with the consent of his wife and 10 children, he abandoned the secular life and became the hermit known as Brother Klaus. While spending one night in the open, a flash of lightning brought him the revelation that he had to remain close to his house rather than wander through the world. The peasants in his village built him a tiny house with an altar. One window was open to the people, and another small one allowed light to shine on the altar. His perpetual fasting became legendary, as did his deep wisdom. The chapel dedicated by Zumthor records the memory of the saint through the materiality of the edification. Built with the help of the local farmers, as was the original chapel, the new one employs a building technique called rammed concrete, where layers of concrete are poured over a formwork of timber, which results in a texture similar to rammed earth. The farmers in the community poured a layer of concrete every day for 24 days in a row, and at the end, the interior timber teepee was set on fire. Thus, the exterior texture is that of rammed concrete, whereas the interior one is of burnt wood. The lightning that originally brought the revelation to the hermit is thus remembered through the charred matter that is analogous to the illuminated flesh. The floor is made of lead, and the triangular door is a metal sheet. The small openings in the walls that evoke the communication Brother Klaus had with the mundane world are glass rods that end in spheres which capture light like candles. Recalling the window of the original chapel that was shedding light on the altar, an opening at the top exposes the modern chapel to the elements and brings the divine light inside. Thus, dirt and light, past and present, community and individuals are brought together in a process that activates the material imagination of sacred architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea. Again, 40 questions and things I'd love to jump into right now. Okay, let's keep moving, and I'd like to introduce Henry Menzies, which I will do in 1 second. Let's see. Well, you know, guys, before I had this so worked out, let's try this. There we go. Okay. Henry Harding Menzies is with us today. Received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from the School of Design at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's worked for a number of firms before starting his own. He worked for Perry, Shaw, Hepburn, and Dean Architects, and then John M. Gray. He was co-founder of the Architects Group in 1962, where he conducted a private practice until 1978. And after moving to New York City, he formed the partnership of Menzies and Lemieux from 78 to 82. Since that time, he's been in his own private practice in the New Rochelle, New York, concentrating on Catholic sacred architecture. Help me welcome Mr. Menzies. Pardon?
Can I wait for this slide?
I think you should be ready. No?
No, I don't want to slide. No.
I'm sorry.
Well, you can leave it.
Is that okay?
It's okay.
All right, thank you.
Fine. Some years ago, a Protestant was visiting for the first time a Catholic church with a Catholic friend. After entering the front door, the Protestant expressed admiration for the beauty and the warmth of the door, decor, and the architecture. He noticed that at the far end, there was a table that appeared to be placed in a prominent position. Over the table was a crucifix, and on the table was a gold box with a cord of candles on each side of it. The box appeared to be focal point of the decoration. He turned to his Catholic friend, and he asked, "What's in that box down there on that table?" The Catholic answered, "That box is called a tabernacle. And we believe that Jesus Christ himself is really, truly present in that box." Stunned silence. Then the Protestant said, "If I believed that, I would go down on that aisle on my knees." I happen to be a convert, by the way. The Protestant was not a believer, obviously. But he understood that. He understood that if that's Christ himself in that box, he deserves all our profound love, worship, and adoration. His name is Emmanuel, God with us, and he is with us literally in his church. Not the church in general, but every Catholic church where Mass is said and where there's a tabernacle. And that is what makes the church Catholic and different from other Christian churches. Other churches may have great music, great sermons, great prayers, great art, great choirs, great architecture, and we know many do. But they do not have Jesus Christ really and truly present. They do not have the Eucharist. He is present in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which is the reenactment of Calvary, in Holy Communion, and in the tabernacle. For over 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has been a sacred place of worship for millions of people. It has been a place of sacrifice, presence, and glory, where we Catholics go to worship him, to attend Mass, confess our sins, and partake of the other sacraments, the most personal acts a person can perform throughout his life. And central to all of that is the Eucharist. The late Pope John Paul II reminded us that the Church has always felt a great need to celebrate the Eucharist in a setting worthy of so great a mystery. Unfortunately, as we all know, over the past, 30 years, a number of churches, newly built, and I might say renovated, have not been, quote, worthy settings for the Eucharist. Some have been downgraded, trashed, to the point where they are hardly recognized as Catholic at all. Today, many Catholics who come to church looking for God are disappointed and dismayed because he doesn't seem to be there anymore. And they ask, quote, "What happened to the glory?" The mystery has been lost. They find it difficult to find the tabernacle. They're disappointed in the bare white walls and dearth of any paintings or statues. They seem to be entering an auditorium, a commercial mall, a warehouse, devoid of any devotion or sacred imaging. Anything but a Catholic church. Anything. And many are just plain ugly, as Mike Rose said in his book, Ugly as Sin. Along with other architects, some are here, I have been specializing in church architecture for many years. in an attempt to try to rescue, I might say, the heuristic inspiration from the unfortunate trend in the design of new and renovated churches. On a positive note, I have proposed 4 major causes for this downgrading, along with a few simple but doable architectural solutions. First is the lonely table. After Vatican II, when the altar was removed from the back wall, it stood alone and naked in a large space, without any support of any inspirational artwork on the back wall. It emerged as simply a 3-foot, 3-inch high table. It could be made of any material and of practically any size, but it was still a table. And it's what it's meant to be. It's a lonely table. It does not by itself have much importance, no matter if it's made of pure gold. It becomes alive, so to speak, because it represents the body of Christ, but it becomes alive during Holy Mass. Many old churches simply left the old high altar, as we know, all decorated against the back wall, and put a wooden table out in front. And most churches are that way now, old churches. They just put a new tabernacle, altar out in front of the other. The problem is, how do you give a lonely table the notability it deserves, since it comparatively is a small object, dwarfed by its relationship to the large space surrounding it? Of course, you can always design more beautiful altars. One historic solution is to place a covering, a roof that we've heard about, over the altar to proclaim its importance. It's like putting a finger and saying, hey, you know, this is important. This thing that you're looking is important. One is the tester, which is a covering that hangs from the ceiling. The other is a baldacchino, which is a canopy supported by 4 columns. Certainly there are other solutions, but this can add significantly to the grandeur of the altar. 2, the wandering tabernacle. Pre-Vatican II days, the tabernacle sat in splendor on top of the altar, which was against the back wall, the reredos. When the altar was pulled away from the back wall, the question became, where do you put the tabernacle? This question has probably caused more problems and confusion than anything else in church design. The fact is that after being, quote, liberated from the altar, we've had the problem of the wandering tabernacle. It's looking for a place to settle. In some churches, it has simply been left on the old altar. And this is probably good. However, in some, it's located as in a recess, in a side wall, in a column. In others, you can't even see it. It's out of sight, or it's in a closet with the brooms. Apparently out of the way. In others, it's still in the sanctuary, but in a secondary location to the right or to the left. The apparent downgrading of the tabernacle goes completely against the general instruction of the Roman Missal, which says the most blessed sacrament should be reserved in a tabernacle in a part of the church that is truly noble, prominent, readily visible, beautifully decorated, and suitable for prayer, end quote. However, in many churches, the tabernacle is not placed in a prominent location, much less beautifully decorated. Some are frankly quite ugly. I won't name them, but I wrote an article on that one subject, that they seem to have fun designing ugly tabernacles for some reason. This random placement gives the impression that it is of no more importance than the ambo, or the baptismal font, or the organ. It is any wonder then that many people are unaware of Christ's presence in the tabernacle. Many pass in front of it without any sign of recognition, a simple bow or genuflection. This general loss of devotion to the Eucharist has been noticed by many over the past years. One bishop quoted saying, we quote, "We have all experienced a lessening of devotion to the Eucharist, a loss of the sense of the real presence the sense of the sacred has suffered, I can't help believing that placing the Eucharist in a separate chapel, often hidden and often small, is part of the reason we have a crisis in belief in the real presence. Out of sight, out of mind. That's what's happened. It is true that one solution is a separate chapel. The problem is most churches are not large enough to do this, except, of course, cathedrals, you should do that. However, in most churches, frankly, there's not enough room. Consequently, the tabernacle must be located in the sanctuary. If it is not conspicuous, I think the best solution is to locate it on the axis directly behind the altar, where it used to be. Now, I say this because if you put, just common sense, forget about art theory, if you put anything off the main axis, assuming the church is designed on an axis, and most are, even around churches are, a main axis, if it's off the axis, it says this is not that important. Everything on the axis for the altar is important. I mean, you don't have to go to school to know that. So if it's off, what do you balance our Lord with? A tabernacle, an ambo, a flag? There's no balance there. So it's got to be in the middle. My suggestion is better. The lectern, certainly nothing in the church besides the altar is more important, and to place it off center is to downgrade it. Third, the blank wall. When you're at Mass, you're facing a blank wall behind the altar. The reredos wall, whatever you want to call it, you're facing in a direction if you're looking at Mass, and there's a wall behind it somewhere. In pre-Vatican II, this back wall is sometimes referred to as a reredos, or ornamental screen, being a highly visible area, was ordinarily filled with all kinds of artwork. Paintings, oil paintings, crucifix, marble statues, Our Lady, light fixtures, depending on the style of the church. In many Gothic churches, they have enormous marble wedding cake structures which dominate the entire wall. All this served the useful purpose of unifying the altar, the tabernacle, and the reredos, and placing everything in the most conspicuous place in the church. Everything was directed right there. Everything was together, all eyes were fixed there. But when the altar moved forward, the tabernacle relocated, and the wedding cake ripped up, nothing was left except a white blank wall and just maybe a long single cross, or if you're lucky, a crucifix. The barrenness of this dominant blank wall, which used to contain inspirational artwork, no matter what the style, mitigates against any sense of the sacred. Most people, I think, sense that something should be done there, something should be there, but is affirmed by the fact that flags, banners, organ pipes, potted palms, posters are installed to relieve the bleakness. Obviously, none of these is capable of producing a sense of the sacred. The story is told that in the early days of the liturgical renewal in Germany, a new church was built in which all the walls were white. I think we've seen them in this symposium, all white walls, dead white. When the architect was asked about this treatment, he explained that white, quote, showed the immensity of God. Unfortunately today, many people are forced to gaze at blank walls, which are as much more likely to serve as TV screens for their imagination as pious thoughts. The last is a lost art. We've been talking about it really during the symposium, generally. When all these statues, paintings, and artwork were removed, as a matter of fact, there's a church in New Rochelle where there are no statues, and I asked the pastor what happened. So he took me back to the closet, and there they're all the statues in a row. That's where he put them. When these things were removed, all other artistic works followed and were also removed. Many churches were left with little or no art except maybe a crucifix. Some maybe had a cross. Most artistic representations of the Passion of the Lord disappeared. Statues of saints with devotional candles in front removed. the same time, modern art came in, and what did come in was so abstract that it fails to inspire any kind of devotion. Bereft of any inspirational art in the churches or saints to pray to, it follows that the private devotion of believers is bound to suffer. This is not to say that old art was good art or inspirational art. Much of a sentimental, candy cake stuff, fruit, and schlock art, let's face it, let's call it what it was, schlock. And some did demonstrate the deep devotion of the faithful, a devotion which they are now denied many times. On the other hand, not all new art is bad just because it's new. It can be very nice. It can also be very abstract. As an aside, I don't think we architects go around telling people we're classic architects or Gothic architects or modern architects. I've always considered myself a modern architect. I try to use the new materials and innovations that we modern architects try to do, but to ignore the past and the principles of design of the past is to ask for, what do I have, 2 minutes? Oh my gosh, I got all the slides, sorry. Okay, sorry, I have some slides. I do a lot of renovation work. I'm sorry. Yeah, just the first one. Okay. Well, I'd rather do something later. I mean, this takes more than 2 minutes. I'm sorry. Well, I'll give you one then. This is a modern church built in the 70s in New Canaan, Connecticut. There was an architect who had the idea that he would design he was a Protestant, and he would use the Alpha and the Omega symbolism. The plan was an Omega. Now, you know who sees a plan? Birds and helicopters. People don't see plans. Architects see plans. And the Alpha was outside, was a tower. Anyway, here's what we had. I grew up as a Presbyterian looking at the choir and the pulpit because we didn't have the Eucharist. Here in this church, you looked at the choir and a very unfortunate altar, but one little cross up there, and then 2 doors, clear glass. All the people, that was a parking lot, all the people would come in. You could see all the people coming in late. It was all white. People, you couldn't see the tabernacle was out of sight. People couldn't see it. So anyway, I'm sorry, I have so little time, I'm sorry. That's another view. What happened to this? Okay, well, I missed some. Anyway, to be brief, I knew there was a famous stained glass man, his name is Frederick Cole in England, and my idea was if I could get Mr. Cole, wow. Well, anyway, this is, well, I'm sorry, my good slides are gone. If I could get him to design a nice rear doss of stained glass and inside stained glass, and put the tabernacle underneath it in the middle on the axis of the altar, and behind it put the daily mass chapel, and I designed the tabernacle so it was two-sided. It's two-sided tabernacle, and behind is the daily mass chapel. If I could do that, and he would create such a beautiful thing, we would have something. But otherwise, it would be a disaster. So we had to completely gut the church. I'm sorry.
We will correct the PowerPoint and get it on the website so people can see it.
Okay.
But we probably should go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, all right. Wrap up? Okay. Well, anyway, let's see. We can run ahead to, by the way, that was an A tower. That's the Alpha. Nobody knew it was a church. That's the outside. I designed the tower. We don't have time. That's from the inside. The other was the cathedral well, I'm sorry, we're not seeing the before. If you can't see the before, you don't know what I did. They ripped out, destroyed the cathedral inside in St. Augustine in Bridgeport. And so, well, I can't explain it, but anyway, this is just some pictures of it. I put the tabernacle in the front, I redid the floor, I designed the fixtures, I painted the ceiling. It was quite a job. I had a baldachin. I never designed a baldachin in my life of bronze. Okay. Anyway, can I just end with this thing? So we had the, I wonder if it comes out. No, it doesn't. Too bad. Okay, but let me just say, we had a, can I just say that we had a wonderful dedication, and it was dedicated December 2nd, 2003 by Archbishop Gabriel Montalvo, Apostolic Nuncio of the U.S., rededicated the cathedral, attended by Bishop Laurie, the bishop, and 13 other bishops around New England, New York. Also present was Edward Cardinal Egan, Friar Bishop of Bridgeport and New York, William Cardinal Keller of Baltimore, plus 200 priests. Deacons joined representatives of all 87 parishes in the Diocese of Bridgeport, the full choir and orchestra, and fantastic music. You've never heard such music in your life. Anyway, Archbishop Daniel Cronin delivered the homily, and he finished with a great quote from St. Augustine, the patron, which I'll end with, which I was quite moved. Quote, "We are gathered together to celebrate the dedication of a house of prayer. This is our house of prayer, but we too are a house of God. If we are a house of God, its construction goes on in time. It may be dedicated at the end of time." Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menzies, very much. Well, I have not given us time. I did something. I think we actually had an extra speaker for this session, so we don't have time for questions, and I apologize. But we're going to go ahead and set up for lunch. We should have lunch coming in shortly. And I'd ask you to keep your questions, and we'll have several moments of large discussion period from now on out for the rest of the afternoon. And if you all could all raise questions, please. This session actually represented a kind of diversity that I was hoping our whole symposium would have, that there were really many different ideas coming together, and I'm very excited that we had that. So again, sorry I haven't left enough time for that. We're going to go ahead and start lunch here very shortly. Thanks a lot.